Hello, and welcome to part two of the biological approach, where we're going to have a look at biological structures. So, the first system we're going to have a look at is our neurons and the nervous system. So, the nervous system, as you may have learned before in biology, is comprised of several connected systems. So, we have the central nervous system, or the CNS, which is made up of the brain and the spinal cord, vital part. And then we also have the peripheral nervous system, the PNS, which is what we call the somatic and autonomic nervous systems. Now, we will be covering these in much more detail later in biopsychology, and also you will be looking at some of these in psychopathology as well. So, what does the nervous system do? It carries messages from one part of the body to another using small structures that we call neurons. So neurons transmit these nerve impulses in the form of electrical impulses, and many aspects of our behavior are under neuronal control, including breathing, eating, and sex. So these little structures are vitally important for keeping us alive and enabling us to do the things that we do on a daily level. We're going to look more specifically now at the brain, which is the largest part of the brain, is called the cerebrum, compiling 85% of the brain mass. The outer surface is called the cerebral cortex, which is responsible for what we would call higher order functions such as thought and language. The cerebrum is divided into two hemispheres, and it's joined together by the corpus callosum, which is a sort of a bundle of nerve fibers in the middle, which connect the two hemispheres together. So let's just have a look at the brain in a little bit more detail. So you'll see that diagram on the left. You've got the different lobes. You've got the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, which is sort of at the top of your head. You've got the occipital lobe at the back, and then the temporal lobe on each side. So the frontal lobe is responsible for your executive functions. So thinking, planning, organizing, and problem solving, emotions and behavioral control, as well as aspects of your personality. So we talk about the frontal lobe being quite responsible for things like emotional regulation in people, very important part. Your motor cortex is responsible for movement, muscle movement. Your sensory cortex is important for sensations in terms of how your sensory cortex will pick up sensory information from the environment. Your parietal lobe is involved in perception, making sense of the world, and has been particularly associated with things like arithmetic and spelling. Your occipital lobe is responsible mainly for vision. And then your temporal lobe, quite an important part here, is very important for memory, understanding, and language. So do have a go in your booklet at sort of try to memorize this and try to name the different parts of the brain. This can be asked in an exam, so you do need to know these parts of the brain quite well. Now, I want to look a little bit more closely at neurotransmission. Now, this is something you will do a little bit in a little bit more detail when you get onto biopsychology module. But this is just really an introduction of how this works. So these little structures called neurons, they sort of relay messages to each other. So what happens is, you can see that on the left-hand side, you have a nerve impulse which reaches the end of the neuron. And if you look at the diagram, that nerve impulse will go down the axon, okay, to the end of the neuron. You've got those little red dots there. The neurotransmitter, now an example of a neurotransmitter would be something like serotonin, dopamine, adrenaline would be released into the synapse, which is that gap between the one neuron and the other neuron. And we call that the synaptic gap. So the neurotransmitter travels across the synapse, and then the neurotransmitter, the chemical, whichever one is transmitted, will trigger the receiving neuron to release another impulse, another electrical impulse, or it might stop it from doing so. So we talk about these triggering impulses can be either excitatory or they can be inhibitory. So the triggering impulses, the excitatory neurotransmitters are, for example, adrenaline, dopamine, and those preventing impulses in the next neuron would be the inhibitory neurotransmitters, for example, serotonin, which should sort of calm that next neuron down. So don't be too concerned if this is quite new stuff. So we will be coming back to this in more detail throughout the course. In terms of biological structures, you will come back to this quite often. Just to add to this, I would suggest that you go to page 132 of your textbook once you have got a textbook and read a little bit about the influence of the biological structures on behavior. There's a good section on neurons in the nervous system, the brain, and then in particular the influence of neurochemistry on behavior. There's a nice section on there which will describe it very nicely for you.